Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, students, friends, and tonight also neighbors. Welcome to this evening's discussion. My name is Luisa Białasiewicz, and I'm Professor of European Governance in the Department of European Studies here at the University of Amsterdam, and the co-director of ACES, the Amsterdam Center for European Studies. On behalf of ACES, I wanted to welcome you to this event, which is actually the fourth event in our virtual Visions of Europe series that we have been organizing this spring in partnership with SPUI25, starting already on the 29th of April. So a weekly event every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. So one thing I wanted also to say is a huge thank you to our colleagues at SPUI, especially Jeske Brouwer, who helped put this together, because I think it's a unique opportunity in this moment to have some of these, what we hope are quite important discussions. Now, tonight's evening builds on the three previous events, three previous conversations that we've been holding every Wednesday night, that have really kind of spanned a variety of topics. We started out by thinking about questions of public health, risk sharing, questions of health security. We talked in the second session about socioeconomic questions and the mostly lack of European solidarity in this moment. And then last week, in last week's session, the discussion turned to how national and European politics is being transformed in this moment. And so kind of the repercussions of this moment for domestic and European politics. So I'd like to very much thank all of our colleagues who have participated in these events so far and who have very graciously given their time and input. And I encourage those of you who are not able to see the events live to click on the links that are available on the SPUI website, and you can see the events that have been, in fact, taped on YouTube. But let's come to tonight's event. And tonight, as in previous weeks, we are very fortunate to have on this virtual podium 4 speakers who I think are kind of uniquely able to comment on the geopolitical implications of the pandemic. And you will notice that so far I've avoided using the term crisis, even though it's in the title of our series. And willingly so, because I think one of the questions that I hope we can engage tonight is to what degree using that term crisis and you know kind of seeing, in this case, geopolitical transformations from a crisis perspective limits our understanding of the various shifts, of the various transformations taking place. One other important point for tonight's discussion, and this also kind of linking back to our previous events, and one point that I hope we can keep in mind is that just because the focus of this panel is on geopolitics, is on kind of potential shifts in the international order and in regional orders, I think it's very important not to kind of draw this hard distinction between the domestic and the international, the domestic and the geopolitical, because just as this pandemic has broken down any kind of fantasy of, you know, kind of maintaining the territorial sanctity of the state, you know, kind of the fantasy of controllable territorial borders, so too I think our thinking about COVID's political and geopolitical effects needs to go beyond this distinction, because the two are, you know, inseparable. And as we will see, and I think as has already come out from various, you know, kind of discussions about the geopolitics of COVID, domestic failures, and I'm thinking here of the United States quite evidently, certainly, you know, impact quite strongly states' position in the international arena. So speaking of this, you know, the importance of context, the importance of keeping together the geopolitical and the domestic. I think our four speakers tonight are, as I said, uniquely positioned to comment on that. They come from quite significant regional expertise, if I can call it that, but also we thought are able to bring a kind of keen appreciation of how various regional actors are entangled within wider global orders and actually contribute to its remaking. We also made the conscious choice of inviting to this panel two historians, a political scientist and a political economist, also to give a variety of perspectives and to provide a kind of a range of readings, let's put it that way, of the current moment, also beyond just this moment. And once more, I think, especially in a time like now, that is being read predominantly, very strongly, through a lens of exception, through a lens of emergency, having kind of being able to have a perspective, a longer term perspective, and moving away from kind of emergency crisis readings is especially important. So I will introduce the speakers to you as they come to the floor. But first, I wanted to say a little bit about the structure of this evening. And for those of you who are by now veterans of this virtual series, my apologies for the repetition. So we will begin with each of the four speakers giving a short opening presentation, somewhere around 5 minutes. And then following that, the speakers will have a chance to react to each other, kind of follow up on particular points, respond to questions from each other. And we will do this, I promise, briefly, then opening it up to a wider discussion. In the meantime, and you will be aware of this, hopefully from the emails you have received, all of you will be able to submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will be able to see them as they arrive. And as I said, I will take those up. Hopefully we will have many interesting questions, and then we will follow on to a live Q&A afterwards. So let me introduce to you the first speaker of tonight, Dr. Julian Groene, from the Department of Political Science here at the University of Amsterdam. And Julian is Assistant Professor in Transnational Governance, as I said, in the Department of Political Science, and a specialist on China. His work, more specifically, looks to the different financial technologies that characterize Chinese capitalism, or Chinese authoritarian capitalism, as he also terms it in his work. Now, Julian, you noted that you would like to open with some thoughts about how the pandemic has been reshaping China's positioning vis-a-vis Europe as a partner, but also as a systemic rival. So I will give you the floor, and we'll be very curious to hear what you have to say about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm extremely happy to be joining you for the roundtable tonight. Yes, so thank you for the invitation. With 5 minutes, I'll get straight to it. What I would like to talk about tonight is to map out, as you mentioned, the evolution through COVID and to look beyond of China's relationship with the EU. So just a first quick scene setter. Before February, before everything started to unfold, the European Union seemed to be making some progress with its China policy and strategy. This was most evident with the strategy paper last year in March, which depicted China as both partner, competitor, and systemic rival. And there was progress in terms of this. In terms of fleshing this out policy-wise. The immediate effects of course, with COVID-19, much of this has been delayed. The March EU-China summit was cancelled. The second summit cancelled, planned for September in Leipzig. which was envisioned as a way of sidelining the 17+1 grouping between China and Central European and Eastern European states, is technically still on, but no one seems to know what will happen. The broad-ranging bilateral investment agreement is still on the negotiating table, but it seems very unlikely that it will be resumed or much less concluded in time for that. So those immediate effects, amidst also a significant diminishment of Sino-European trust related directly to the circumstances of COVID, but as well as the propaganda, the disinformation, political pressure from China. This has created, of course, a significant trust deficit that will be very hard to recoup going forward. So those immediate effects, but moving into the short to medium term, I'd like to highlight two countervailing trends that are emerging and the consequences of which are still relatively unknown. And they're countervailing in the sense that it's a loosening and a tightening of relationships and networks. Supply chains have been disrupted, and where this has taken place in essential goods and sectors, such as, for example, pharmaceuticals, there are alternatives that are starting to form and which might prove to be relatively durable into the future. So there's that kind of loosening of pre-COVID economic relationships particularly, and that can be seen as something of an opportunity. At the same time, there's also a tightening of relations and networks through public and private Chinese actors moving to secure their interests amidst the crisis. This is, of course, mass diplomacy, the CCP being very outspoken, and Chinese enterprises are also seeking to move into European corporations and companies. So this is all relatively apparent, but what I would like to really focus on with the 2 minutes that I have remaining is to move into the medium and long term, which, when thinking about those next months, this loosening, the tightening, and into the next years, well, the COVID crisis has really, and I use the word crisis there, we can discuss that going further on, but the pandemic, the crisis has revealed acutely the difficulties with this repositioning from the European Commission at the highest level of the partner, the rival, and the competitive of China's strategic status in European policymaking. And what I'd like to underscore here is that it has revealed the ambiguity within these three labels. At one end of the spectrum, you have the notion of economic partnership. This is cooperation in areas of shared mutual interest, also economic and global governance. At the other end of the spectrum, you have systemic rival, which is at the level of worldview and values. So, and this is reaching deep into the distinction between liberal democracy versus authoritarian modes of governance. And in between, you have this notion of competitor, which is still highly ambiguous and remains for the EC and the European Union more broadly to grapple with much more deeply. And there are these economic and political logics at play here. There was always this gap between these economic and political logics, but previously there was a greater sense of a shared mission, that of some degree of convergence between them. Essentially the political would be following the economic to a certain extent. I realize that I'm already over 5 minutes, but I just want to highlight, and I'm happy to talk about this in more depth later on, that simply China has always been very good at integrating these two logics, the logic of economic cooperation for political purposes, whereas the history of European integration, of course, indicates that this is, the EU is not nearly so adept at playing that political economic game. So this harder edge reality has been exposed, and it's increasingly clear that China's efforts to shore up the resilience of its own political values is deeply connected to how it is functioning as an economic partner or competitor within the European context. So I'll leave it there. It's very important to pay attention to what is actually happening in Chinese politics. I'm happy to take some more questions on that. But ultimately, it amounts to a dropping of the pretenses in the Sino-European relationship. Propaganda, clumsiness notwithstanding, this is all directed towards a deeper strategic repositioning, which is happening as much in Beijing as it is happening in China. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Enormous issues in the space of 5 minutes. So thank you for trying to do that. And I think it gives us a really nice, as I said, opening to the debate, because in a sense, when you talk about geopolitical repositioning in this moment, I mean, even if you're not focusing on China, the kind of the specter of China is very much there. And I was just thinking of, I don't know if people will be able to see it, this cover of The Economist from about a month at this point back, is China winning, and kind of seeing the role of China as a kind of a key locus of other regional shifts. So I think this I think gives us a very nice kind of opening to thinking about also what is happening in other regional orders. So I'd like to give the floor now to my colleague Artemy Kalinowski, who is a senior lecturer in Eastern European Studies in the Department of European Studies at the University of Amsterdam, and a historian of the Cold War, whose regional, in a sense, specialty is particularly Central Asia, and somebody who is also a frequent commentator on the enduring echoes of the Cold War and Cold War geopolitical visions. So, Artemy, you noted that one of the kind of points that you wanted to raise was both kind of thinking about how relations between Russia and the EU also have the specter and the presence of China. And also kind of think about what that kind of shift in relations means for a wider Eurasian geopolitics. So I will give the floor to you right now.
Great, thank you. Thank you for organizing this, Louisa, and also thanks to Liza for keeping us on track with all of this. As I said to Louisa earlier, I don't think Corona is going to change Russia's relationship with Europe or the US or China or the Middle East very much. It may accelerate some trends that were already underway, for example, rising US-Chinese tensions driving Russia and China closer together. But I don't think what's happened over the last 2 months, what's continuing to happen, crisis or not, is really going to change that fundamentally. I think it may have an important effect domestically in that it has already revealed the limits of Putin's personal power and of Russian state power. And here, I'll be curious to hear what George has to say about this, but I think we have an interesting parallel with the US, which is that the crisis has laid bare the weakness of the state when it comes to anything beyond its kind of penal functions, right? So the police function in its most limited sense, and particularly beyond Moscow, the weakness of the health system, the public health system, has been made very clear. And this is not something that you can fix overnight. So, unlike with factory closings or salaries not being paid somewhere, Putin cannot just show up and say, get it done and make a big show of it and have everybody clap for him. In fact, what we've seen is Putin trying to step back very often, delegating to the regional leadership wherever he can. And so the weakness of the state becomes much more apparent. Recent measures to replace lost income will help mitigate the damage and the pain for a lot of Russian citizens, but remember that they're coming after years of declining real incomes, basically going back to 2013, if not earlier. So to be clear, I don't think any of this means that Putin is about to be overthrown or forced to step down, but rather that the genuine popularity he enjoyed has been eroded and will continue to erode now at a faster pace. Now, where the potential for greatest geopolitical change is within the post-Soviet space, and this is connected with migration. Labor migrants around the world are now finding themselves in a very difficult situation, either because they cannot travel for employment they were counting on, or because they're stuck in a host country without being able to earn an income or go back home. In the post-Soviet space, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of Central Asian labor migrants, particularly from Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, but also Ukrainians, Moldovans, and others who go to Russia for work and whose families back home count on remittances. And a protracted economic slowdown can have, and almost certainly will have, very serious economic shocks, and also political aftershocks. Remember that we're talking about a region where in several places, political succession is very much a hot topic. Kazakhstan in particular, Tajikistan, where actually the response to Corona was muted because the president wanted to make a show of preparing his son to take on the leadership, and as a result, didn't want to cancel the whole series of events that were connected with that. But it also raises, I think, questions about the future of Eurasian integration, right? I think the Eurasian Union was never going to be another EU, but it seemed for a while that it would, at very least, be a more meaningful institution than the various attempts at integration that started with the Soviet collapse itself. So with December 8th, 1991, and the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, which doesn't actually amount to very much, but it still exists. But what has this Eurasian Union offered in terms of coordinating the response to the crisis, either in a public health sense or in an economic sense? There's been talk, leaders of the Eurasian Economic Union getting together on Zoom, or whatever the leader equivalent of Zoom is, just like we are now, and talking about coordinating something and talking about promoting economic stability, but it doesn't seem to amount to a lot of any kind of practical measures. Yesterday's video conference summit likewise seemed to show that what the poorer countries want, Belarus, Armenia, and so forth, primarily is cheap gas, while what Russia wants at this point is anything beyond selling gas at a subsidized price. It's looking for fuller economic and political integration, is in no mood to talk about lower gas prices without that. Kazakhstan's main contribution seems to be to insist that no one should have to give up any sovereignty to make this union possible. So the crisis, or non-crisis of Corona, has laid bare how desirable will this be? What is this Eurasian Union really for? What is the purpose of this union to the Russian public, to Central Asians, to states like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan that Russia was hoping might eventually join? Remember that one of the reasons that this union was attractive to Kyrgyzstan, for example, is that it made it easier for Kyrgyzstani citizens to work in Russia. But there's no work to be had in Russia, and Russia is no place to offer significant economic support to the poorer countries, unlike China, which, by the way, has been very quick, I think, to kind of bounce back and say, we're still here, we're still ready to help out by sending doctors, by sending economic aid. Russia is, I think, very much not willing to take up this task. So the question then is, what is the draw of this kind of integration? So that's my opening pitch. I'm curious to hear what others think.
Thank you very much for that, Artemi. And I think, it's interesting to think of the kind of parallels between what the Eurasian Economic Union does and the lack of, let's say, not just, solidarity, but kind of what can the union do for you, and the kind of the rush to protect sovereign powers there, if we kind of think of what has been happening at the EU level. So I'd like to kind of move slightly from the Eurasian sphere into the kind of the borders between Eurasia and the Middle East, and pass the floor to our colleague Heinz Gärtner. Heinz is university professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna. He is also the academic director of the International Institute for Peace in Vienna. He has written extensively on US-Iran relations, including a recent volume that has just come out on Iran and the international system, one of the few books actually that speaks to this topic and that also engages Iranian scholars. Heinz, you noted to me that one of the topics that you would like to raise are kind of the wider implications of this moment for regional geopolitics in the Middle East, but also for the US's role in that region and US-Iran relations. So I'd like to turn the floor over to you, please.
Thank you, Louisa, for organizing this excellent series. Also, thank you, Liza, for setting this meeting up. Of course, Middle East, I could talk about all kinds of issues in the Middle East, also on the broader Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the occupation of the West Bank, which is now timely because of the new Trump and Kushner plan. I'm not going to do this now. As Louisa mentioned, I'm more working on Iran for many years, and we'll talk a little bit, 5 minutes, about several issues. The whole thing started with the nuclear issue, so I start with the nuclear issue as well. It's the Iran nuclear deal, very briefly. We cannot avoid it and move on to COVID and to the Corona crisis, and then the role of the EU, and then what Louisa mentioned about geopolitics. And if I have some time, I make also some suggestions. The GCPOA, somehow Austria and myself have a vested interest in this agreement, because when it was negotiated in Vienna in 2015, almost every day went to this Coburg hotel where it was negotiated in order to get out information, bits and pieces. And Zarif, John Kerry, came out and told us a little bit. And so we got the impression it was the best negotiated arms control agreement in history. Every full stop and comma has been negotiated, and it has been wrongly reported in media, and especially by the US administration, that there's there is a sunset clause. On the contrary, the agreement is permanent. In the preamble, it says Iran never will acquire nuclear weapons, and the whole agreement, and including the preamble, are based on international law, because it's enshrined in Article 2231 of the UN Security Council resolution. So it's international law. I avoid the technical details of the agreement. However, there have been many hopes attached to these agreements after 2015. Iran, of course, hoped for more economic development. For the EU, it was a masterpiece of effective multilateralism, and also the EU hoped for investment. And for Obama, it was an example of engagement policy. The whole thing, of course, ended in 2018 when Trump stopped it and stopped its participation in the agreement. And there's some paradox in it, which I will talk about it a little bit later. And the US imposed more and more severe sanctions on Iran, including travel prohibition to the foreign minister Zarif, and we all had all these incidents in the Persian Gulf. So you don't know who to attribute them. So who is to blame for, except when Iran took the responsibility itself. But in all pre-war situations, we have these incidents. It can be constructed, maybe not. We don't really know. I remind you on the Tonkin resolution in 1964, which was the second attack on the American battleship was set up. So, but it was the basis for the 10-year-long Vietnam War. And the peak, of course, was the assassination of the General Soleimani, and he was an official figure, and he basically is comparable with the Secretary of Defense of the US. So that would be if you assassinate the Secretary of Defense. So Iranian response was moderate. An attack on American airbase. Nobody was killed. However, the US increased sanctions and called them maximum pressure. And now we have this COVID crisis, and Iran is one of the most hit countries in the region by this pandemic. And now Iran feels, of course, even more the sanctions. So there was the Iranian government and Zarif tried to get a sanction relief because of humanitarian reasons. because Iran did not get all the medical supply it needed, and also the respirators were included in the sanction regime. So there was no mechanism. There's some countries which tried to help Iran, but most of them are limited or prohibited by sanctions, because most of them have to pass the the American financial system, like the Swiss humanitarian and trade mechanism. So basically everybody who provides humanitarian goods to Iran has to ask the Americans first. So there was no sanction relief, and unfortunately the European Union in this situation, short before Iran was really hit by this pandemic, triggered the dispute settlement mechanism, which means that after 30 days, the whole nuclear issue would go to the UN Security Council, because Iran step by step withdrew from its obligations of the JCPOA, and now the European Union would say, actually it was under the pressure of the US, would say that might be a violation of the JCPOA, and we might transfer it to the Security Council, and then the so-called snapback sanctions would kick in. That means without a vote in the Security Council, all the UN sanctions again would be introduced on Iran. High Representative Borrell was actually in the last minute, he found out what kind of risky game this is. And he said, no, we don't have a time limit. Usually the time limit is about 2 to 3 months of this dispute settlement mechanism. And he said it's open-ended. So we will have no deadline. Now what happened now, because Borrell said this, Secretary of State Pompeo said, okay, no, we didn't leave the JCPOA. Formally, we are still part of the JCPOA, and now we want to bring the issue before the UN Security Council. Even so, the US terminated its participation in the JCPOA. But now they are saying, okay, we want to be part of it again in order to trigger this dispute mechanism. In order to, I know I'm over the 5 minutes already, to come to this geopolitical issue. So Iran is blamed about this behavior. You heard this in the media, bad behavior, malign behavior by the US. So it's all Hezbollah. We can talk about this, support of Hezbollah, Hamas, which is for the Iran is a second line of defense, basically, because conventional weapons, it is very weak with conventional weapons. That's a debate about agent, but we have, as political science, we have to look at the structure. So, Luisa, let me just say this, because now this is the geopolitical part of my presentation. There's a study out, it's called Global Firepower, and it looks at all countries in the world with the geopolitical potential. Not what they really do, but the potential of what they have. And Iran, because of its resources, its infrastructure, its educated people, its geographic location, mountains and coast areas, and its disciplined military, Iran comes out 12th in the global ranking. So if Iran could use all these resources, of course, that's what neither Saudi Arabia, not the US, nor Israel could accept. So the whole debate is about hegemonic competition, and all these neighboring states, including the US, with any means want to prevent Iran to use its potential to become a hegemonic power in the region. So I do have some suggestions as well, which I will bring maybe later in the debate, because I have 6 minutes already, I guess, and stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Heinz. And, and again, I think covering these issues within such a short time period is actually very cruel on our part as organizers. But I think we all appreciate that these Zoom events are very difficult kind of to follow in longer kind of interventions. But thank you for getting us to think about the US role, because, kind of the shadow of the US role and of the US presence. And then, you hinted already at the fact that the EU's geopolitical attempts in this region are very much bound to the presence of the United States and what is possible, what is considered in the realm of the possible. So I would like with this to turn to our fourth speaker, who will address specifically the US role. George Blaustein is senior lecturer in American Studies and History at the University of Amsterdam. And you've written extensively about the myths, geopolitical and others, of American power, American decline. And you noted to me that one of the things that you wanted to talk about tonight was the kind of the persistent yearning, if not nostalgia, for, if not the American century, then a certain US role in the world, also on the part of Europeans, even though we may not be very good at admitting that. So the floor is yours, George.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Louisa, for convening this panel. Thanks, Liza, for organizing us. Thank you, everyone else, for making it hard for me to sound wise. I have some remarks I'll try to keep within the time. The coronavirus has been visited upon a world still adjusting to the American vacuum, the great sucking American vacuum. I'm going to say some quite obvious things about the American context, and then say something about the implications of those obvious things, and then get to some despairing questions that I don't know how to answer. It's safe to say that this crisis, and I share the suspicion of the word, Corona accelerates the ongoing crisis in the transatlantic relationship. We need a better word than crisis. That's the question for us. That makes events terrible yet unsurprising. Some premises. The European Union and the United States are both enormous entities, but also in their way thin entities. In both contexts, the coronavirus has revealed again the fissures of federalism. This is alongside Artem's great point about the weakness of the state in certain ways. The governmental drama in the United States centers on tensions between state and national politics, analogous to the drama of member states and the European Union. It makes more sense to compare Germany to, for example, New York than to the United States. I think that's true. But people abroad habitually look to the US for something called leadership, and once again find Trump eroding American power in the world. To Europe, Trump's actions will inevitably look like a spectacular form of perversity. The European travel ban, withholding funds from the World Health Organization, and so on. These seem like spectacular withdrawals from institutions that were, at least in part, aspirationally benevolent expressions of American hegemony. They were aspirationally benevolent, hegemonic expressions. I'm being kind. I see Artem's glance at me. Expressions of American leadership after 1945. Why, the question goes, would the US destroy the liberal international order when that order has been so good for the US? That question tends to see Trump as a cause rather than a symptom. In the Q&A, we can go into that, I suppose. Anyway, American national politics is defined by spectacle, whether it is the spectacular idiocy or cruelty of Trump, or the spectacular failure of the American Democratic Party to answer him. Such spectacle, as well as the emotional identification that goes with it, is relatively absent from the EU, which makes it possible for the European Union to operate or to withdraw, to claim the mantle of responsible technocratic governance, and to fall into the political traps of that mantle of responsible technocratic governance. And so the European story has been one of the nation states reassertion as would-be heroic actor and locus of public identification. Since the states of the United States are not nation states, we don't typically think of the US in those terms, but it might be illuminating to do so. The American story is one of devolution onto member states of the American Union, so to speak. The states, too, would seem to fill an American void or to become voids themselves. Wisconsin, The Guardian reported yesterday, is starting to resemble a failed state. That happens to be my own home state, and I have been horrified by it. Some state-level politicians, meanwhile, emerge on a kind of world stage, Andrew Cuomo most prominently. And states are doing some curious things internationally, such as the state of Missouri suing the People's Republic of China legally in state court. So actually, when we look at an American outcome, we face a whole panoply of outcomes, state-level disasters, as well as some relative success stories. Those, in turn, will inflect national politics in ways that I think are quite unpredictable. What does this mean for the storied transatlantic relationship? I don't know. Can anyone know? Geopolitics would seem to teeter above biological and economic realities, while the political entities fixate neurotically on the economy. As a cultural historian, I can say little about those truly decisive economic forces, but I have been struck since living in the Netherlands by European nostalgia for the American century. That nostalgia is understandable, perhaps. The American order was at least a kind of order. But in the current extremity, the nostalgic expressions merely illustrate the further erosion of the relationship. The nostalgia has become fully ironic in the literal and literary sense of dramatic irony, saying one thing and communicating another thing, knowingly or not. So inversions abound. Ursula von der Leyen's call to EU nations to invest billions for economic recovery is framed as a Marshall Plan for Europe, which is a wonderful ironic redundancy. We could call it a pleonasm. It brings me no joy to criticize this nostalgia. I teach in a field in Europe that has been dubbed the intellectual Marshall Plan. Meanwhile, within the United States, the Trump administration evokes the heroic Berlin airlift of 1948 and 1949 as a template for its Project Air Bridge, launched in late March. It's more of an inverted airlift. Medical supplies produced in Asia are lifted to parts of the United States, but investigative journalism reveals that to be vastly exaggerated. It is yet another Potemkin village in the time of Corona. These episodes would lead to the unsurprising conclusion that the coronavirus has accelerated pre-existing US-European divergence, with the added twist that European invocations of that storied transatlantic alliance are now made emptier than they were before. I can stop there. Maybe I've even gone within my time, and that will leave some room for discussion. What to do with our nostalgias. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And yes, you did keep to time. And, you know, actually, before I turn it back over to the four of you, I think I wanted actually to throw two questions back at you. And the first one regards specifically nostalgia, because what is it that we are really nostalgic for? What is it that we would like to re-emerge in the current moment? I mean, I think, you know, certainly it is a nostalgia in some parts for, you know, the US role, but is it really that, or is it a kind of nostalgic reworking of what we thought was a multilateral world order, what we thought was the post-war order, which probably really wasn't? So I think I'd like to kind of throw that out to you, because I think that is one of the big questions right now regarding the possibility for multilateralism. and for a new role of international institutions, international organizations. And I've seen that actually there are a couple of questions already kind of hanging from our audience on that point.
I probably won't have a satisfying answer to the question. I'm not exactly sure how to answer it. I will say I can now argue against myself. Maybe nostalgia is the wrong word, or we have to break it apart. It's the most obvious repertoire. It's part of the, and maybe it's less, at least for the spokesman of a kind of establishment foreign policy world in Europe, it's their foundational script to return to the 70 years of transatlantic partnership and so forth. So on one hand, it's a foundational script. After that, I think it's a specific desire for a return to Obama-era foreign policy, and that I think is probably a misplaced. That's where the nostalgia is. That's where the nostalgia is misplaced. But I'm actually. I almost want to punt on that question because I think other panelists will answer it better than I can. So I shall.
Who would like to take this question of multilateralism next? Evgeny.
Well, I'll actually start with nostalgia because it's a big trigger word if you're in the post-Soviet space. Yeah. And I think it's worth thinking about, what is the work that nostalgia does for the leaders of Russia and the US on the one hand, but also the way that people in their supposed spheres of cooperation, let's not say spheres of influence, look to them, right? I mean, I think, one of the reasons that Russia starts up organizations like the Eurasian Economic Union and doesn't do much with that is because it takes nostalgia for the Soviet Union as a given. It just assumes that it's there and that as a result, Russia will always be in a position to lead, right? Without having to actually provide any kind of substance to it. I think there's often an assumption in American political discourse that nostalgia really is there. The question is, why do European leaders seem to hold on to this nostalgia? I think that's the interesting paradox that George raised, because going back to most of my adult life, the US has been pretty terrible, right? And even the Obama years, as hopeful, the US has been pretty terrible, I mean, as a European partner, right? And even if you go to the Obama years, which are, now we see them as this kind of fairly friendly period. I mean, Obama was very openly, very directly saying we're turning away from Europe and we're going to focus more on China. The problem is, if you give up on the nostalgia for that kind of idea of a benevolent US leadership and the kind of transatlantic relationship that comes with that, then you have to really think about, okay, who is going to underwrite an organization like NATO, right? Who is going to be the backstop in all of these kinds of issues? And nobody really wants to think about that. So it's easier to have a nostalgia for something that hasn't existed for a long time, even if it ever did, than to ask kind of hard questions about, okay, that's over if it ever existed, and what do we do next? That's my sense as a Russian American living in Europe.
Heinz, can I ask you to step in on that, because I know you've actually written recently a piece on the changing role of NATO and what can become of NATO.
I don't want to say something about NATO right now. I may just come back to your question on multilateralism and the Obama years. So that was my reaction. Of course, Obama still supported multilateralism. Multilateralism whenever possible, and unilateralism only when it's necessary. And with the Trump administration, it's the other way around. Multilateralism only when it's necessary, and unilateralism whenever it's possible. So, and if you, George has mentioned some of these examples, but we have a crisis of multilateralism right now. So because the Trump administration is attacking or withdrawing for all kinds multilateral agreements, arrangements, but also bilateral treaties. But we have, I mentioned the GCPOA, but we have also the Paris Climate Accord. Trump is attacking the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, withdrew from the INF Treaty, which is a bilateral treaty, but still it's a treaty, and attacking the International Court of Justice. So it's all kind of attacks on multilateral organizations and on treaties. So listening to your presentations now, China, Russia, US. So what we are doing is we are moving towards a multipolar world. So multipolar world in a stronger sense means polarization. We are moving towards a polarized world. So we have a polarized, more polarized world. Case in point is China now. China is in the debate in the US is everywhere. For campaign reasons, of course, Trump is using China and COVID as a scapegoat for his own failures, and he's blaming China for everything. But it emerges already a post-corona world as a superpower, big power confrontation. Trump is preparing for this. So we have this polarized world. But we have this polarized world on the one hand, and no multilateralism on the other hand. Polarization without multilateralism is the case of global conflict. So we had this situation several times. I don't want to play the Cassandra, but it was developing, the same situation developing before both of the world wars. So in a slow motion, maybe not that that fast. So unfortunately, the EU in most of this international crisis is sidelined. Trump is sidelining now the European Union when it comes to the JCPOA, but the European Union is sidelined in his bilateral romance with Kim Jong-un. So where is the European Union? You have a Kushner plan in the Middle East. The European Union has had so many nice plans for a two-state solution. They're all gone. Nobody respects them. So now the European Union has to recover, and the European Union is the only one who really can save multilateralism in the post-corona world. I thank you for the time being here. I don't want to be too long.
No, but thank you for that, Heinz. And you know, I want to take up your call for the EU to take this role. But first, I wanted to give the floor to Julian, because I think, you know, China was kind of called into the debate a couple of times. But there's one question that came through that I don't know if you've seen. And I think one of the big, you know, questions that is being raised is, would China be willing to take on that role as also, let's say, patron, if not protector, of international institutions such as the UN? Or is it not at all interested in playing that role? This is a question that comes from one of our viewers, but I think, you know, I think I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what role China could play in a different sort of multilateralism, and not then necessarily in the sort of multipolarism that Heinz is describing.
Yeah, okay. No, I hadn't seen that question actually, but it's obviously a good one. I was just having a few reflections on this this question of nostalgia, and I think it's lovely. Thank you, George. And in the sense, and I think we'll get to that other question later on. But this sense of nostalgia, even the notion of nostalgia is kind of a bit it's airy, it's a bit whimsical, it's you know, kind of it's not hard-edged, and in a sense the very short response is that this nostalgia within Europe, I believe has left China quite has left the European Union quite flat-footed at this current juncture, and in that sense, that because the nostalgia is really one for what I might provocatively term, you know, the kind of the liberal democratic delusion of the past 70 years. This notion, you know, and that somehow the transatlantic, the liberal world order was in, you know, these very Eichenbergian terms everlasting, and it was just it was really never on the cards. And yeah, if to get further into that, you know, kind of read Wolfgang Streeck on you know, crises of democratic capitalism, so on and so forth. So that nostalgia for that kind of order, I think, has left the EU quite flat-footed, and China has taken this opportunity, and COVID represents China's opportunity in Europe. It's been building up to this moment for quite some time, to be honest, and for a long time, of course, it was keeping its powder as dry as possible through multiple crises, 2008, 2012 Eurozone crisis, so on and so forth. But this change, you know, this move to a multipolar order, and a very strategic one at that, was pushed onto it, of course, by the United States. All of a sudden, Trump was in the White House, and we all know what's happened since then. But now, COVID has provided China with both the opportunity and also the need. This also ties into then relations with Russia, yeah, as I was saying before, to drop all of these pretenses, and Xi Jinping, I think, has actually timed it extremely well in that sense. So that's to move on, yeah, to speak to the institutional role that China might possibly play in this evolving order. Then I think we can see it evolving along the same trajectory, in the sense that it is simply going to keep its economic interests as secure as possible, and when it either needs to, or where there is an opportune moment, its political interests will be revealed. And I don't see that changing when it comes to how it's strategically engaging with the institutions of global governance and multilateral institutions. This is quite apparent, I think, thus far, in terms of with the United Nations. Of course, with the WTO, it's been that case for 20 years almost now. So on and so forth. So I don't see China stepping in to defend in any way the liberal world order. China is, of course, actively constructing an alternative set of institutions that are much more amenable to its interests, and that will continue. Thank you.
Thanks for that, because we actually have a question that kind of from the audience to follow up on that, kind of thinking about, you know, and not perhaps the building of a parallel set of institutions, but a parallel set of alliances, relationships, etc. And I think, you know, one of the points, Julian, that you made in your opening presentation was this, you know, so far we're trying to separate the economic from the political, which in a sense was what the EU did for many, many years. And thinking, for example, of relations between China and African countries, we can also think of relations between the EU and European countries and African countries, where geoeconomic relations very often are much stronger than geopolitical ones. How do you think this moment, and this is a question to all of you, will change those relations? And Artemi, I know you've worked a lot on the kind of geopolitics of development aid and of kind of imaginations of development assistance in the post-Soviet space, but not only. So thinking about relations, I mean, so far we've been talking about the relations between these players and a shift from multilateralism to possibly a multipolar order. But how about relations with the rest of the world, with the global south, but not only? Who would like to answer that first?
Well, I mean, we've seen Russia in the last 10 years or so try to reclaim some of its old, or let's say try to claim some of the old Soviet role as a donor in the development sphere, and particularly, as you said, in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East more as a security actor, and then also in Latin America. But of course, again, that was underwritten by the kind of oil wealth, or oil and gas wealth, and the confidence that went along with that. It never had the kind of importance for you know, if you're going to be constructivist about it, it didn't have the kind of importance for Russian identity that, for example, holding off NATO from, or stopping Ukraine from becoming part of NATO does, right? Or even of playing a dominant role in Central Asia. And I'm afraid that, you know, as far as relations with Sub-Saharan Africa or even Latin America go, it's kind of easy come, easy go. If in the coming years, economically, it's no longer viable to do that, I think Russia will pull back.
Thank you for that. Heinz or Julian, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
May I? Can I talk? Yeah. Now let me just come back a little bit to the debate before and then move on to this EU. I also want to pick up a little bit the debate on the Middle East and Iran. So there's some relation. Of course, we have now this the merging US-China polarization. So we can see it on the horizon. It will go on after the American elections. That's what I predict. There would be, of course, some possible analogy for a solution, and we have to look back, and that would refer to the Iran issue as well. If we look back to 1972, when Nixon and Kissinger went to China, and despite all this domestic criticism in the US, and of course Nixon was a Republican, and there was hawks who said, "Don't do this with this communist regime of Mao." Nevertheless, they went there, and it was basically one of the most successful summits in history. Of course, Soviet Union played a role as well, so there was some balance of power game going on too. However, we had all these communist insurgencies. We had the Vietnam War, and during this situation, Nixon goes to China and meets communist Mao. It had consequences. Mao said, okay, now we had this Shanghai Declaration, and the Shanghai Declaration, that was a very general declaration of the summit, what said both states would renounce hegemony in East Asia. So that was basically the Shanghai. Mao didn't want to support all these communist insurgents anyway, and Nixon wanted to leave somehow Vietnam to find a way. So it did not play out entirely, but Mao reduced his support for these insurgents, and Nixon tried to prepare the withdrawal of US troops of Vietnam. Applying this to the Middle East, that would be a solution for Iran-US relations. Both sides would have a general declaration: we renounce hegemony in the Persian Gulf. The Iranians don't want to support all these so-called boxes in the region anyway anymore. They don't have the money and resources for that. And Trump said he wants to leave the Middle East somehow. He didn't do it, but he said it as a campaign promise. So that would open up some possibility for safe, face-saving relations. A general declaration on to renounce hegemony in the Persian Gulf. Am I too long? Otherwise, I would say something to the European Union. Let me say very briefly. We have these nice concepts in the European Union. I think this European Union global strategy was basically the best paper on foreign policy what the European Union has produced. And we also have this strategic autonomy, but it was not implemented because the European Union is not there in the hotspots in the world, is not there. When it comes to neighboring states, so the closer and the wider neighborhood of the European Union, the document developed the concept of principled pragmatism, which is different to the Lisbon Treaty. In the Lisbon Treaty, basically, it says, Lisbon Treaty in Article 8 says, you neighboring states, you have to become like us, you have to share our values. Well, I'm exaggerating, but that was part of the Ukraine crisis as well. Now this principled pragmatism says, okay, we accept you, we have our values, but on this basis, we accept your values and we want to deal with you on this basis. So that goes for the eastern neighborhood, but also for the southern neighborhood. And I guess multilateralism is what all of them can share and support. So I have another point, but I stop here for the moment, and maybe I have the chance to say something else. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Heinz. And it's, we've got a variety of questions that have come in the meantime that have to do with the EU role in the Middle East, or kind of thinking if the EU can take a role and what sort of actor should it be to be able to take a role. Coming back to points that all of you made in one way or another about the role of the state. And Heinz, you noted, this kind of categorization of geopolitical powers or states that have geopolitical potential and how that thing called geopolitical potential is calculated, is considered. And, as I'm a political geographer and had the misfortune of being schooled in kind of classical geopolitical theories, beyond, kind of territory, population, armaments, et cetera, one of the kind of guiding points there was this idea of the role of the strong state, and that a state has to be strong internally to be able to project power externally. And I am shocked to this day to what degree that idea is still with us. And before tonight's debate, I was reading an opinion piece by a leading European think tank, I won't mention which one, talking about the impacts of Corona on geopolitics, and opening actually with citing Henry Kissinger, saying that geopolitical actors such as the US, Russia, and China all possess a distinctive control over their space, resources, and the communities within their borders, including a relatively high level of internal cohesion and political unity, which is what makes them strong geopolitical actors. Now, I think we've noted, certainly for the case of Russia and the United States, how that internal cohesion, internal unity has unraveled. In China, I think also, one of the things that I think we need to, also be kind of wary of is, kind of the pronouncements of, China somehow successfully emerging out of the crisis because it has managed to keep a hold on its population, on its economic system, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess I wanted to hear from all of you some, kind of comments on this, on the fact that this idea, kind of talking about another nostalgia. I think this is also this idea of, only strong states can be effective, powerful geopolitical actors, but also dispelling some of these myths of the fact that these states are strong states, which hopefully can then lead us to a kind of discussion of what sort of other geopolitical actor could the EU be? Because it certainly ain't gonna be a strong state. Julian, can I turn to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. The myth of the strong state and how that might apply to China's case at the moment. No, you're absolutely right. There's a common tendency amongst China scholars and watchers as well, that the Chinese state is this kind of invincible monolithic entity. Yeah, think back to the early, back in January, even early February, when a number of commentators were looking to this point as you say, the unraveling of Xi Jinping's state and regime, and that it's absolutely important to recognize the deep kind of travails of public sentiments that's and opinion and and dissatisfaction within China. But that is exactly also what links China's current actions to the broader picture amidst American and Russian difficulties in coherent governance and state action, because what is coming out of China and disinformation, its public diplomacy, something that I didn't really get to talk about earlier was that, from Europe, from our perspective, it's quite easy to see what China has been doing in terms of its propaganda as just incredibly clumsy, and we think, what were they thinking? Well, what they're thinking is that they need to shore up public support at home as well. It's vitally important to pay attention to this. The pushback against China and this propaganda is firstly highly effective back at home in China, and any sense of uneven reciprocity in how this is unfolding amidst the crisis plays well into building up and shoring up the strong state back at home. So Xi Jinping's regime at this point looks, to be honest, it does look surprisingly strong and robust and coherent, as opposed to kind of 2 or 3 or 4 months ago. And as to that other question of whether or not you need a strong state to be an effective geopolitical actor, this is, well, unfortunately, I guess, maybe I come down on the side of answering positively to that when you are faced with with others that are capable of fulfilling that role. And China, I think, is at this point, the juxtaposition between how China is able to engage with the European Union is a case in point. So the European Union needs to, and I saw that there was a question from Jonathan relating to this, that's the European Union needs to find a way to bring those politics and economics together in the way that China is able to, that the United States is increasingly less able to, and unfortunately, if we're looking to the long-term implications of COVID, then this is going to be this need is increasingly severe. And unfortunately, the signs that we're getting at the moment are that this is going to be as much of an uphill battle as it ever has been. So, I can see that we're well out of time, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
No, I mean, that's great. And, you actually touched upon a point that is raised in another question from the audience regarding the role of communication and public diplomacy, and specifically, kind of new communication technologies. Because right now we're not just talking about projecting hard power, but also projecting a certain vision of yourself as a geopolitical actor. And as you're very rightly saying, China has been doing that very ably. But George and Artemi, I wanted to hear from you on the Russian and American perspectives on this, also on the communication side and myth making. George, do you want to jump in next?
Yes, it's a good question. In a way, it relates to some degree, at least, to the weakness or strength of the American state. I think it's actually possible, pessimistically, I would say that Trump, if Trump holds on to power in the next election, it will be because, or like communication technology is, news media and Twitter are key elements of that, would be key elements of that victory, despite the obvious failures despite the obvious failures of the federal government to respond in a way that any average citizen could take a kind of pride in, and that the strength-weakness thing will play out on the states in a terrible way, on the level of the states in a terrible way, such that in Wisconsin, for example, the Republican Party will sabotage the...
You're still here.
Okay. I got a bizarre alert suggesting that someone else had signed in from my account on another computer, as suggesting
the Russians.
Yes, suggesting exactly a parallel Zoom debate. In any case, I worry that on the American state level, this will redound to Republican victories, and it will be Democratic government, Democratic state administrations that take the fall for some of these, for this disaster, largely because communication technologies have eroded the bastions of kind of local journalism that would have prevented such an outcome. That's one answer for a kind of the billiard ball of communications technologies in a political outcome. But the truth is, I don't really know. Artemi?
Well, I'm a little bit wary of answering the question about communication technologies, because in a way I'm very much a scholar of the post 1991 era, in the sense that I'm used to being able to go to the places I study on a regular basis to kind of feel out what is going on. And the weird thing about preparing for a panel like this is you're reduced to only reading about, only reading the Russian news and maybe Russian social media. And you can try to call your friends in Russia, but they're reading the same news social media, which, then you go on Zoom to discuss it. So, it does suggest that when you're reduced to that, there's more of a kind of echo chamber. At the same time, I think, at least in Russia, people, I'd like to think, are a little bit more inoculated, a little bit more used, again, more able to take what is coming through these channels with a grain of salt. But that is more likely, I think, to produce cynicism rather than active engagement. The people who are engaging, which tend to be younger people, by the way, without any connection to the Soviet period, if you look at the age groups, I think are ignoring state messaging completely and starting from something else. But I think that's a longer discussion. I think it's worth noting, though, that Russia was never really a strong state, right? It has always behaved, or at least since the late 17th century, it has behaved as one, but it has not had the attributes of a strong state in the sense of being able to collect taxes in a regular way and having solid knowledge about its own population that it could act on, and so on and so forth, right? And we can think of some of the worst episodes of the kind of Soviet era as actually resulting from that same kind of weakness, right? You couldn't actually use the bureaucracy to move the population around or to extract things from it. So you use something massive like collectivization, like terror, and so on and so forth. And that hasn't stopped the Soviet Union and Russia from projecting power abroad. It doesn't do it even now, right? As long as you can find enough people to staff your military and enough resources to support that, you can project power, right? The amazing thing, I think, that the US managed to do for a long time is to actually sustain fairly high standards of living, at least for part of the population, and project that power in a massive way. And I wonder if that's actually something that's coming to an end in front of our eyes.
Thank you for that. And I think, this coming, to another myth, which is precisely that of the fact that these are, in fact, strong states. So apart from, what the think tank that I was just quoting was saying, that, this is how the EU fails because it is not a strong state like those strong states, which, in many ways are not. And the points that you made about the United States, about Russia, and Julian, that you were making about China, I think are very valid. So then coming back to the EU, I mean, if we let go of those myths, both the need to, emulate or reconstruct orders that were never what we thought they were, or only partially. I mean, they were very much, geopolitical myths are very powerful. we use the term myths as, I mean, they're not just fictions. They mobilize people, resources, war machines, and they have always done so. So it's, you know, geopolitical imaginations are extremely powerful. I think in thinking, and you know, I'm looking at other questions that have come in. Many of them, in fact, you know, kind of center on this. Okay, if the EU is to save multilateralism, if it is to become a stronger global player, maybe emerging out of this current moment, what again should it become without emulating those models? Unfortunately, Heinz, I think you mentioned the von der Leyen Commission's, you know, kind of emphasis on becoming a geopolitical player. I mean, the push from this commission is actually to go very much to capture those myths. So from a very kind of strongly geopolitical language, and admittedly so. I mean, the G word for many years, until very recently, until the global strategy was just, you know, it didn't enter into the commission speak at all, to actually talking about the need for a military presence, and in very, you know, kind of strong language. Is that the role that the EU should be pursuing? Heinz, I'll turn to you, since you already made some points on that, and then I'd like to hear from the other panelists as well.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. That's not the role of the European Union. It never will be able to compete with the United States, and even in the long run with China on the military terms. So that's the EU would contribute to this polarization. So, and I was saying the EU exactly should avoid this polarization and move back to multilateralism. And we do have these geopolitical myths there. And if you read all these defense doctrines, security strategies of all countries in the world, basically, von der Leyen contributes a little bit to this. You always read, we have there enemies out there, foes, rivals, competitors, adversaries. So it's full, all these documents are full of this language. So, and now back to nostalgia. I went back to another document, which I think was the best document Europe and the world actually produced, and it was at the height of the Cold War. It was the Helsinki Final Act. So, and if you read the Helsinki Final Act, you don't find no one of these expressions. No height of the Cold War, no enemy, no foe, no rival. So it's all about cooperative security, common security. Security is indivisible, and economic cooperation on the level of civil societies, science is especially, and this document actually had also political implications, because it was the basis for the civil society in Eastern Europe, especially for the Charter 70, what contributed to the fall, basically, of the Iron Curtain. So the document had also a decalogue of common values and back to communication, and it was published in all the CSC member states. So we should look at this document and try whether the European Union could do something like that today. You also could apply this to the Middle East, since I talked about the Middle East. So there could be a regional dialogue, but the Iranians, basically Zarif also always suggested there could be a regional arms control negotiations forum. The CSC document also would set up a conventional arms control negotiations on the conventional forces in Europe. So the opposite to this geopolitical myth and the hard power competition. So the European Union should look back what has been done and has been successful in the past. And today we can, of course, slightly change the language, not saying only security is indivisible. Now today in Corona times, health is indivisible. So unfortunately, we're talking about all this China, US competition. Fortunately, scientists of China and the US, even Iran, European Union, they're working together. So they're trying to find the sources of this pandemic. They don't think so much about competition. So European Union could foster this cooperation. It can be started on the lower level, science, technology exchange, and it could spill over to a political level later on. But this, and also climate change. Climate was responsible for the emergence of new bacteria and viruses. So that's a basis for new cooperation. So looking at the political system of Helsinki, applying to the requirements of today, the virus knows that there are no borders. So science should know it as well. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. And I think, this would be a very good way to kind of wrap up our discussion, because we're also very much over time. Remembering that there were other models, and I'm pleased that, I was joking at the start that we brought together historians with political scientists and but it was a political scientist that was reminding us of, the need to remember the past of the EU, and that indeed other world orders have been imagined and practiced in the past, that, the post-war world order, as we imagined, mythologized it, and yearn for right now, is not the only one possible. So I think that's a very kind of important thing to keep in mind, and going forward, to whatever order will emerge from this moment. I'd like to thank all of you very much, and to our very patient audience, especially those who stayed with us well over time, those of you who sent in your questions. And before we close, I wanted to remind everybody that next week, next Wednesday, we have the final and closing debate of the series, which hopefully will answer the question that we kind of set out here at the end. What on earth should the EU do? How should the EU emerge out of this moment? How can it reimagine itself geopolitically and otherwise? So I encourage everyone to sign up for next week's event. The registration link is available on the SPUI website. And thank you once more for attending tonight, but thank you especially to the panelists for taking their evening to share your thoughts with us. Super interesting, and I think I'm really the wrong person to moderate an event on geopolitics, because I would have kept you guys talking for another hour probably. But thank you very much. I hope we at least raised some interesting questions for everybody, and we will continue to think about these things. Thanks again.
Thank you, Louisa. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed.
Thanks, Louisa. Thanks all. Nice to see you all.
Bye. Thank you.